The wind carried a bitter chill across the endless stretch of the dust-water plains, rattling the wooden sign that swung lazily above the town's one saloon. The sun had already begun its slow descent, painting the horizon in muted shades of gold and red, the light slicing through the haze of heat and dust like a sharp knife. Somewhere, far off in the distance, the clip-clop of hooves beat a lonely rhythm against the dry earth. Jack had been riding all day, and the ache in his shoulders was a familiar companion. But it wasn't the heat or the miles that made him pause. It was the faint, almost imperceptible sound that had caught his ear, soft whimpers, muffled against the wind. He dismounted, feeling the cool bite of the evening air settle across his skin. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional clump of scrub and the skeletons of abandoned homesteads. His boots sank slightly into the soft dirt as he followed the sound, each step deliberate, careful. And then he saw her, or rather the sack that moved with a subtle, agonized shift on the ground. A body, abandoned, left for nothing but dust and wind. Her small hands pressed against the sides of the rough canvas, trembling. The faint whimpers now rose to desperate gasps. Jack knelt beside her slowly, keeping his voice low, gentle. "Hey, easy. It's all right. I won't hurt you." The sack jerked, then stilled, as if the sound of human words had startled her, but not enough to make her fight. She was small, no more than 14 or 15, with the gaunt curves of someone starved and alone. Her feet, bare and smudged with blood and dirt, poked out from the bottom of the sack. He noticed the bruising, the dried streaks of tears along her dust-caked cheeks. His own throat went dry. The smart thing would be to leave, right away, and forget what he'd seen. But something in her tiny, trembling form rooted him to the spot. Jack's mind flashed back to Dustwater's gossip, to the warnings he'd been given about wandering strangers and the dangers of the plains. Never pick up what isn't yours. Trouble comes in small bundles, wrapped tight. But he ignored the echo of the townsfolk's caution. He tightened his grip on the canvas, careful not to hurt her, and lifted the edge just enough to peek at her face. Her eyes were wide, the color of storm clouds, reflecting fear and exhaustion in equal measure. And then he saw it, bruises pale and angry against her skin, a crimson streak along her cheek that looked almost like liquid fire against the dust. Her lips moved, forming a sound he couldn't quite catch, and her small hands clutched at the canvas as though it were the last tether to some invisible safety. Jack's heart tightened. This girl had been left with nothing, no one to fight for her, no one to call her own. And here he was, a man whose life was defined by quiet solitude and the careful keeping of his own morals, now faced with a decision that could change everything. He eased the sack from her head, careful to let her eyes meet his without the shock of sudden light. The way she flinched was instinctive, trained by fear into every muscle. Jack whispered, "I won't hurt you. You're safe." Her blue-tinged eyes searched his, suspicious, desperate, yet clinging to something she hadn't dared hope for in a long time. The plains behind them shimmered under the dying light, the shadows stretching long and eerie across the dust. The town of Dustwater was a few miles off, a cluster of wooden buildings that had seen better days. The wind tugged at the edges of Jack's coat, carrying the faint scent of smoke from distant fires. He glanced down at the girl again. "What's your name?" There was no answer. Not yet. Only the soft, uneven breathing, the tremor of muscles wound tight against months, maybe years, of hardship. He settled himself on the dry earth, careful to make himself smaller, less threatening. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered her hands, the tension in her body easing by fractions too small to measure in any moment, but crucial in the quiet space between them. Jack studied her features, a sharp jawline softened by youth, sunken cheeks that still held the ghost of beauty, and eyes so expressive they seemed to carry the weight of every lonely night she had endured. Her small frame quivered under his gaze, but there was also a spark, something stubborn and defiant that had refused to die despite all the neglect and cruelty she had faced. He considered the practicalities, of course. Where would she sleep? How would he feed her? What would the townsfolk say? Dustwater was not kind to strangers, and never to girls who carried the scent of hardship. But Jack also knew what it was to live with moral certainty on one hand and moral duty on the other. He had spent enough nights under the stars thinking about right and wrong, about who deserved help and who didn't. And yet here, before him, was someone who didn't have a choice. Someone whose existence was precarious at best, and whose survival rested for now, entirely in his hands. Jack rose slowly, keeping his movements calm, steady. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's get you somewhere safe." She did not respond, but she allowed him to take her small, bruised hands in his, guiding her to his horse. Her body was fragile, and he adjusted his own weight carefully, never rushing, never speaking louder than necessary. He swung her gently onto the saddle in front of him, holding her with one arm as he mounted behind. The wind tugged at his coat, and the girl pressed her face into his back, as though the scent of him could anchor her to some sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. The ride to his cabin was silent except for the whisper of hooves against the hard earth and the faint, uneven breathing of a child clinging to life. The sun had sunk further, leaving the horizon ablaze with streaks of orange and violet casting long shadows over the plains. Each mile that passed was a small victory, a reclamation of hope in a world that had offered her none. And when Jack finally reached the edge of his property, the worn wooden cabin standing against the sky like a sentinel, he felt the first pang of real concern, not for himself, but for her. Because the world beyond these walls would not understand, would not forgive easily. He dismounted and led her inside, keeping the door between them and the endless plains outside. The cabin smelled of old wood and smoke, a quiet, steady scent that spoke of survival and solitude. He helped her down and set her near the hearth, where the weak fire still held warmth. The shadows of the room danced across her face, emphasizing the bruises, the streaks of dust and blood, and yet also illuminating the fragile strength in her eyes. Jack's throat tightened, and he swallowed the knot of emotion lodged there. The plains outside were silent now, but he knew the danger of being seen with her, the judgment he would face from a town that never forgave, never forgot. And yet he could not turn away. Not now. Not ever. He knelt beside her again, voice low, steady. "You're safe here for now." Her eyes met his, stormy and wary, and for a moment, Jack wondered if she would ever trust anyone again. Then a faint nod, a tiny, trembling motion that was both a surrender and a question. She had no name, no home, no one, and yet somehow she had found him. The wind howled outside, carrying dust and secrets across the plains. Jack stared at her small, bruised face and thought about the journey ahead, the whispers of judgment, the threats that would come, and the impossible choices he would have to make. He had no answers. Only this moment, this fragile spark of life and trust that somehow, against the odds, had found its way to him. And then, from somewhere in the distance, a faint sound, like a warning carried on the wind. Jack stiffened. He didn't know if it was danger or merely the restless cries of the plains, but he did know one thing. Everything had changed the instant he lifted that sack and saw her face. And the world beyond his cabin would never allow him to forget it. The fire crackled softly, sending tiny sparks into the shadowed corners of Jack's cabin. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, the dusk settling into a muted gray that blurred the line between earth and sky. Kiona sat near the hearth, knees drawn to her chest, the slight tremor in her hands betraying exhaustion and fear. Jack moved quietly about the room, fetching a tin cup and filling it with the warm broth he had left simmering over the embers. Every motion was careful, deliberate, meant to avoid startling her, but also to preserve the fragile trust he sensed in her gaze. He handed the cup toward her, letting it rest on the floor before kneeling down to speak softly. "You don't have to drink it if you're not ready. Just smell it, see if it's all right." Her eyes flicked toward him, wide and suspicious, before she inched her hands forward and took the cup. The tremble remained, but she sipped carefully, tiny gulps that barely seemed to touch the contents. Jack watched, noting the slow easing of tension in her shoulders as warmth seeped into her body. He settled on the floor beside her, leaning back against the wall, and let the silence stretch between them. It wasn't empty, it was measured, a kind of quiet acknowledgement that this room, for now, was a safe haven. The boyish dirt of the plains clung to her skin and hair, but beneath it, Jack could see the stubborn defiance in her posture. She had survived the desert, the dust, the loneliness, and even now, she refused to break completely. Jack thought about the warnings he'd heard in town. "Never help strangers," old Tom, the blacksmith, had said. "Especially girls left to rot in the sun. Trouble follows them like flies on carrion." But Jack knew better than to weigh his life against the cost of someone else's suffering. His hand itched toward the rifle propped in the corner, a familiar weight that reminded him of the laws and the dangers he'd faced on the plains. Yet even as he considered the consequences, he found himself leaning closer to Kiona, offering a steady presence, a calm that he had rarely allowed himself before. "Do you know your way around Dustwater?" he asked gently, watching her eyes narrow slightly. She shook her head, keeping her gaze fixed on the cup in her hands. "You don't have to answer," he said. "I just need to know if someone's looking for you, or if you were left alone for good." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and a single nod told him more than words ever could. Jack leaned back and rubbed his face with a roughened hand, thinking about the practicalities. He had space in the loft for her to sleep, and there was food enough for a few days, but the world outside the cabin was unforgiving. Dustwater was a small town where news traveled fast and rumors traveled faster. Word would get out, neighbors, travelers, anyone passing through, and the questions would come, the judgment, the whispers. Helping her was no longer a quiet act. It was a choice that carried consequences heavier than either of them yet understood. He glanced at her again. "I'm Jack," he said, letting the name settle into the quiet room. "You can call me that." Kiona's eyes flicked toward him, not quite meeting his gaze, but she didn't shake her head. It was enough for now. A small victory, fragile but real. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, and shadows crept across the cabin like slow, deliberate intruders. Jack stoked the embers, letting the fire grow just enough to ward off the cold. "You'll need rest," he said. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but you'll be safe here tonight." Her shoulders shifted slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible relaxation. She wasn't nodding, not yet, but the movement spoke of a willingness to survive, to endure another night under someone else's protection. A knock sounded faintly at the door, just enough to startle them both. Jack's hand went instinctively to his rifle, his body coiling with reflexive caution. "Who is it?" he called, his voice steady but carrying the edge of command. Silence answered. Another rap, quicker this time, urgent. He rose slowly, keeping his eyes on Kiona, who had pressed herself closer to the hearth, her small hands clutching the cup like a talisman. Jack opened the door a crack, peering into the twilight. No one was there, only the wind teasing the dry prairie grass and carrying the faint whisper of a distant hoot owl. Still, the knock had been deliberate, human. Someone had been close enough to see the cabin, and now the knowledge of her presence posed a new risk. He closed the door carefully, his mind already turning over the possibilities. "Someone's out there," he murmured, sitting back down and letting Kiona lean against him for the first time. The movement was cautious, hesitant, but there was trust in it, however small. "They won't stay long," he added, more to reassure himself than her. "But tomorrow is when we'll have to decide what to do next." Kiona said nothing, only pressed her head against his chest briefly before drawing back, still wary. Jack could feel the rapid thrum of her heartbeat beneath his hand, a rhythm that spoke of terror and defiance, exhaustion and hope, all tangled together. He whispered her name softly, testing it, letting it settle in the room. "Kiona, you're safe here." Hours passed slowly. The fire shrank to glowing embers, and Jack kept a watchful eye on the small girl beside him, listening for every sound in the darkness outside. He thought about the warnings he'd ignored, the voices of men who would have condemned him for taking her in, and yet he could not regret the choice. His moral compass had shifted in that moment, and there was no turning back. Finally, sleep began to pull at him, heavy and insistent. Kiona had dozed, curled into herself on the floor, the tin cup overturned beside her, forgotten. Jack sat back, hands resting on his knees, eyes scanning the shadows that moved across the cabin walls. The world beyond the cabin was unpredictable, brutal, and unforgiving. Yet, for the first time in many years, he felt a measure of clarity in the chaos, a purpose born of compassion, fragile as it was. And he knew the morning would not bring peace. It would bring questions, neighbors peering from doorways, whispers carried on the wind, perhaps even anger or threats. But for tonight, the small victory was theirs. She was alive. She was here. And he would guard her, even against the judgment and fury of a town that had no place for kindness, no understanding for a man who would risk everything for a child abandoned to the dust. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, scattering the last of the sun's light, and the shadows deepened, stretching toward the cabin like the hands of a waiting world. Jack drew a slow, steady breath, keeping his body relaxed yet ready. The choice had been made, and there was no turning back. Kiona had been left in the dust with nothing. And now, at last, someone had lifted her from it, saw her face, and refused to let the world take her from him again. The first light of morning spilled over the horizon, soft and hesitant, painting the dust-water plains in muted gold and amber. Jack had stayed awake most of the night, listening to the wind sift through the dry grass, every rustle, every distant sound alerting him to the world beyond his cabin. Kiona still slept in the corner, curled on a blanket he had laid out, her small frame shivering occasionally despite the fire's dying warmth. He let her rest, keeping his own thoughts moving, circling possibilities and consequences like cattle driven across a dust-choked field. By mid-morning, Kiona stirred, blinking against the harsh sunlight that poured through the cabin window. She pressed her small hands against her eyes, then glanced cautiously at Jack. Her movements were careful, as if every muscle remembered the thread of the past days. Jack didn't rush her. He poured a small bowl of oatmeal and set it on the floor near her. "Eat. You need your strength," he said, voice low and patient. She hesitated, then began nibbling at the food, slow but steady, her eyes never leaving his. Jack's thoughts drifted to the townsfolk. Dustwater was a small place, and news traveled faster than the river after a storm. If anyone had noticed her absence, or worse, suspected she had been somewhere else, they would ask questions, demand explanations, perhaps even come for her. Jack felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. A man could survive the plains alone, but a girl, no matter how stubborn, was vulnerable. And now, by choosing to help her, he had made himself a part of her story, and she a part of his. He spent the day tending to the cabin, repairing a loose board on the porch and reinforcing the window shutters. Every so often, he would glance at Kiona, who moved about slowly, exploring the small space with quiet curiosity. She paused at the small trunk in the corner, touched the edge, and Jack caught her wrist gently. "Easy. Everything here is yours now. Nothing will hurt you." Her blue-tinged eyes widened, a faint trace of suspicion shadowing her features. She nodded minutely and continued her inspection, hands hovering over the rough wood as if expecting some hidden trap. By mid-afternoon, the practicalities of survival pressed heavier on Jack. Food was limited, and he knew he couldn't keep Kiona hidden forever. The town would notice, neighbors would whisper, and someone would inevitably wonder why he had taken in a girl with no family, no home, and no explanation. He tried to imagine their faces, old Tom shaking his head in disapproval, the saloon women muttering about impropriety, the sheriff's eyes narrowing with suspicion. Helping her was already a moral decision, but it was also a political one. Every choice now carried consequences that stretched far beyond the cabin's four walls. He crouched beside Kiona, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." She didn't speak, only blinked slowly, the faint tremor in her hands betraying anxiety he had seen too often on the plains. Jack thought about the warnings he'd ignored, about the instincts that told him to ride away and leave the girl behind. Yet, when he looked at her stormy eyes, the echoes of those warnings fell hollow, weak compared to the urgency of survival and compassion. He had chosen to act, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The first knock on the door came in the late afternoon. A sharp rap that made Jack's muscles tighten instinctively. He moved toward the door quietly, hand hovering near the rifle he had leaned against the wall. "Who's there?" he called, voice even but firm. A pause, then a second, quicker rap. Jack eased the door open just enough to peer outside. A man stood there, hat pulled low, eyes shadowed, his expression unreadable. "Morning, Jack," the man said, his voice casual but carrying the weight of authority. Jack recognized him immediately, Sheriff Calloway, the lawman who ran Dustwater with a careful eye on every man, woman, and child. "We've had reports. Folks around town are talking. Saw a girl riding with you yesterday. Care to explain?" Jack's jaw tightened. "I found her abandoned on the plains," he said carefully. "She had no one. I brought her here. That's all." Sheriff Calloway's eyes narrowed. "People don't just vanish, Jack. And folks are worried. You're taking a risk bringing her here. You're putting her at risk, and you're risking yourself." Jack met his gaze steadily. "She has no one else," he said. "And I won't let the town decide her fate for her. Not yet." The sheriff's hand hovered over his belt, a silent reminder of law and order. "You're a good man, Jack, but the world out there, it won't forgive you for this. Neighbors are talking. People are angry. You know that." "I know," Jack said softly. "And I'll face it. But leaving her to the dust would be worse." The sheriff's expression softened slightly, but the warning remained in his eyes. "I can't stop you, but know this. People will come asking questions. You'll have to answer for your choices sooner or later." With that, he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Jack and Kiona in the quiet of the cabin once more. Jack turned back to her, kneeling beside her small frame. "See? You're safe. For now." She looked up at him, her stormy eyes flickering with something unreadable, relief, curiosity, and faint trust all mingled together. Her lips moved, forming the faintest sound, almost a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded, brushing a hand across her hair. "You don't have to thank me. You just need to rest, eat, and stay with me. We'll figure out the rest together." The afternoon waned into evening, and Jack felt the weight of choices pressing heavier than ever. Helping Kiona was no longer a private matter. It was a public stance, a moral decision that would ripple outward. But as he watched her finally relax into the blanket, her breathing evening out as sleep took her again, he knew there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and now the world would respond. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying faint rumors, distant hooves, and the subtle hint of curiosity and suspicion. Jack's hands rested on his knees, and he breathed slowly, steadying himself for the inevitable confrontation. He had chosen compassion, and with that choice came both peril and hope. Kiona had no home, no family, no voice in the world that had abandoned her. And yet here, she had found a man willing to risk everything. And Jack knew, deep in the quiet of that cabin, that the real challenge was only beginning. The town, the law, and the moral questions would come, and he would have to meet them all, not with gunfire, but with the unyielding resolve of a man who had decided that kindness, however dangerous, was the only path forward. The evening sun had begun its slow bleed into the horizon, casting long shadows over dust water and painting the plains in muted tones of amber and rust. Jack kept watch from the cabin's porch, the rifle resting across his knees, eyes scanning the distant ridges and scrublands. Kiona sat behind him, curled against the rough wood of the porch, knees drawn tight, her small hands gripping the edges as if anchoring herself to the world. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from distant fires, and somewhere far off, the hollow echo of hoofbeats beat steadily against the hard-packed earth. Jack's mind turned over the warnings he'd ignored. Dustwater's townsfolk would whisper about the girl in the cabin. They didn't know her, hadn't seen the bruises or the desperation that drove him to take her in. To them, this was interference, danger wrapped up in the guise of compassion. But Jack had long ago stopped counting the cost of moral certainty. This was different. Kiona's life, fragile and raw, outweighed the scrutiny of a town too afraid to act. The sound of hooves on the dirt road reached him, distant at first, then growing louder. Jack froze, his instincts sharpening with the familiar tension of the plains. "Stay here," he murmured, though Kiona's small frame had already stiffened, eyes wide with recognition that danger was near. He rose slowly, rifle in hand, and stepped onto the porch. Two figures appeared first, then a small cluster of riders, mounted men whose eyes were cold and unyielding. Dustwater lawmen, or perhaps just neighbors emboldened by fear. "Jack," one of them called, voice carrying over the fading wind. "We know you've got the girl. Step outside and answer for yourself." Jack's jaw tightened. He did not move immediately. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, weapons half raised, uncertainty flickering in their stances. He could feel Kiona behind him, trembling, her small presence pressing against the weight of responsibility that had settled on him like a second skin. He lowered the rifle slightly, keeping his hands visible. "She's not in danger," he said, voice steady, calm. "She's safe here. You'll do no one any favors trying to drag her into your fears." The tallest man in the group, a rancher with a weathered face and a scowl carved deep into his cheeks, spat to the side. "Safe? From what? From her own kind? Or from the law? We don't take kindly to strangers making decisions for children that aren't theirs." Jack's gaze hardened. She had no one. Left to the dust, starving, beaten, alone. "I could not leave her there." A murmur ran through the men. "You're courting trouble," another warned, his voice low but tense. "You'll be responsible if anything happens." Jack's eyes swept over the riders, counting their numbers, noting the subtle shifts in stance, the tension in their shoulders. They came prepared for confrontation, but none made the first move. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moral choice he had already made, knowing that now the social and political consequences would follow. "I'm already responsible," he said quietly, "and I won't let you punish her for the neglect of others." The tension stretched long and taut between them. Kiona peeked around Jack's side, her small face pale under the shadow of the porch roof. For a moment, one of the riders faltered, glancing at her with uncertainty, the realization of innocence breaking through the rigid lines of suspicion. The air seemed to pause, heavy with judgment and the unsaid questions of morality. Then, the tallest rider barked a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a fool, Jack. Dustwater doesn't forgive fools, especially those who meddle in things they don't understand. Leave the girl, or we'll take her ourselves. You can't hide her forever." Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. He could see the fear in the other riders, the hesitation that always accompanies those unprepared for the quiet certainty of a man who knows what is right. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle and rested it across his knees. "Then you'll do it with my blood in your hands," he said. "I won't let you harm her. Not one hair, not one scratch. You'll leave now, or face the consequences of your own cruelty." The wind shifted, carrying dust and whispers across the plains. Kiona drew herself closer, small fingers gripping the edge of the porch, eyes wide and glimmering with a mixture of fear and hope. The riders exchanged glances, uncertain. No man wants to commit violence where hesitation could cost him dearly. And Jack, calm but resolute, radiated a quiet authority that demanded recognition. After what felt like an eternity, the tallest rider spat again, muttering under his breath, "Damn fool," and signaled for the others to turn back. The hoofbeats retreated down the dirt road, fading slowly into the distance. Jack kept his rifle at the ready until the dust had fully settled, until the echo of the threat was nothing but a memory carried on the wind. He turned to Kiona, kneeling beside her once more. "They're gone," he said softly. "For now. But you need to understand, the world outside will not always be so forgiving. Some people don't understand kindness." Her blue-tinged eyes met his, glimmering with unspoken questions, and for a moment, Jack felt the weight of their shared reality pressed down upon them. She had no family, no voice in the world that had abandoned her, yet here she was sitting, beside a man willing to face judgment and anger for the sake of her survival. Jack leaned back, letting the tension slip from his shoulders in the quiet of the cabin. The fire's warmth licked at the shadows, and Kiona tucked herself closer, finally letting a small, exhausted sigh escape. He had protected her today, but tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moral choices, and perhaps dangers far beyond what Dustwater's narrow streets could offer. Yet in that moment, the cabin felt like the only place that mattered, a sanctuary of quiet, fragile trust in a world that demanded harsh judgments and swift punishment. Jack knew the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. But he also knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that helping Kiona was more than just an act of survival. It was a statement, a declaration that even in a land scarred by cruelty and fear, compassion could still find a foothold. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, and for the first time, Kiona allowed a small, hesitant smile to form. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tiny spark of hope, fragile yet undeniable. And Jack, watching her, understood that the real danger had never been the men outside the cabin. The real danger was letting the world convince him that kindness was weakness. As the last light faded from the plains, Jack and Kiona sat in quiet solidarity, aware that the world beyond the cabin would test them, challenge them, and perhaps punish them for their choices. But for now, within the simple walls of the cabin, they had found a fragile truce with the world, a space where trust could grow, where compassion could flourish, and where the first seeds of a bond, forged in adversity and courage, could take root. The night deepened, carrying whispers across the plains, shadows stretching toward the cabin, and Jack held Kiona close, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. The town may judge, the law may threaten, and the world may demand harsh reckoning. But here, in this quiet, sacred space, they had found something worth defending, a life saved, a choice made, and the unspoken promise that neither would face the coming trials alone. The next morning dawned gray and tentative, the sun barely breaking through the clouds that hung low over Dustwater. Jack rose early, his boots scuffing the cabin floorboards as he checked the perimeter, eyes scanning for any signs of unwanted visitors. Kiona had stayed up late the night before, watching him quietly from the corner, a careful observer of his movements, and now she stirred slowly on the blanket, eyes heavy with sleep but alert. "Morning," Jack said softly, kneeling beside her to ruffle her damp hair gently. "Sleep well." She gave a small, reluctant nod, still cautious, still learning the rhythms of trust. He offered her a tin cup of water and a slice of bread, which she accepted without complaint. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke from the distant hills, and he knew that rumors of her presence were already stirring in the town, carried by travelers, neighbors, and those with sharper ears than conscience. Jack could hear them in his mind, the whispers, the concerned neighbors, the watchful eyes. Some would call him a fool for harboring a girl with no family, no protection, no explanation. Others would call him a hero for doing what no one else had dared. But Jack had never lived for the praise of others. He had lived for the quiet rules he had drawn for himself, and now Kiona had entered his life to test those rules. They spent the morning tending to small tasks around the cabin. Jack repaired the loose boards along the porch and reinforced the shutters while Kiona watched and occasionally helped, her small hands fumbling with nails and rope. Each motion she made was careful, deliberate, as if every muscle remembered the lessons of fear and neglect. He kept his voice soft, giving instructions gently, allowing her to feel competent in a world that had stripped her of agency for far too long. By midday, Jack knew he had to make a choice about the next steps. The town would soon notice her absence, and word of her survival and presence with him would spread. He could hear the faint rumblings even now, neighborly disapproval, the sheriff's cautious inquiries, and the judgment of Dustwater's citizens who weighed every moral act against convenience and fear. He thought of the warnings he had ignored, the cautions of men who lived by rigid codes, and yet, despite it all, he could not leave her to the dust that had claimed so much of her life already. When he finally turned to her, Kiona had wandered to the window, staring out at the plains with a quiet intensity that spoke of both curiosity and caution. "Tomorrow," he said, kneeling beside her, "we'll need to go into town. You can't stay hidden forever. People will start asking questions." She didn't respond, only continued to stare at the horizon, eyes tracing the distant hills where danger and uncertainty waited like predators in the grass. Jack studied her for a long moment, noting the way her jaw tightened, the faint tremor of her hands, and the wary defiance in her gaze. She was learning quickly, learning to navigate trust, to survive, to judge when to speak and when to remain silent. And he realized, with a weight settling in his chest, that the world outside the cabin would not accommodate her growth or survival with patience or mercy. They would have to carve it out themselves, inch by careful inch. By late afternoon, the tension in the air thickened. A group of riders appeared on the ridge, distant but unmistakable, moving deliberately toward the cabin. Jack's pulse quickened. He didn't recognize them at first, until the distinctive patterns of travel and the colors of the dust kicked up by their horses revealed who they were. Scouts from one of the nearby tribes, sent to check on the girl, sent perhaps by rumors or by instinct. The faint drum of hooves against hardened earth carried a rhythm that Jack had learned to fear. He moved quietly to the door, pulling it open just enough to peer out, rifle at the ready. The riders slowed as they reached the base of the hill, eyes scanning the cabin with intent, deliberate caution. Jack's gaze swept over them, counting heads, noting the quiet signals exchanged between them. They were not hostile yet, only watchful, alert, assessing. "Kiona," Jack whispered, kneeling beside her, "you'll need to stay quiet, understand? Just stay here. Don't move." Her eyes met his, wide and stormy, and she nodded slowly. The faint tremor in her hands betrayed fear, but also the first spark of comprehension. She understood that danger was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it was patient, creeping, testing. The riders dismounted with careful movements, circling the cabin, their eyes sharp, scanning every corner. Jack kept his rifle low, trying to project calm, to signal that he meant no harm. And then one of them, an elder perhaps with deep-set eyes and the weight of experience etched into every line of his face, spoke. "We are looking for the girl," he said, voice calm, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command and caution alike. "She is ours. We mean no harm if she is safe." Jack's jaw tightened. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, hoped the world could simply allow them a reprieve, a chance to breathe and recover. But the moral and political consequences of his choice had arrived. He could see in the elders' eyes the expectation of obedience, the judgment waiting to be delivered for a man who had taken it upon himself to protect someone who wasn't his own. "I found her abandoned," Jack said evenly, keeping his voice low. "She has no one else. I will not let her face the dust again." The elder regarded him for a long moment, silence stretching taut between them, before he finally nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Then we will watch," he said. "But know this, the The world beyond this cabin does not forgive mistakes, and it does not forgive the young left without guidance. The riders lingered, eyes sharp, measuring every movement. Jack kept Kiona close, whispering reassurance into her ear. She clung to him, small and fragile, yet slowly, as the hours passed, a tentative sense of calm settled over them. The danger was present, tangible, but it was tempered by mutual understanding, by the shared recognition of what it meant to protect someone who had no one else. Jack knew the coming days would test them both, morally, socially, and physically. He had made the choice to help her, and the consequences had arrived in full force. Yet, even in the face of scrutiny, even with the shadow of judgment hovering at the edge of the cabin, he felt a quiet certainty. Protecting Kiona was more than survival. It was an assertion of decency in a world too quick to forget what it meant to be human. As the sun sank behind the plains, painting the horizon in muted shades of fire and ash, Jack and Kiona sat together, the weight of the day settling across their shoulders. The wind whispered across the prairie, carrying both threat and promise, and Jack realized that the real battle had only just begun, not with rifles or fists, but with the unyielding challenge of proving that compassion, however fragile, could endure.